Good morning. Nice to see you, Alex. And had I known actually we had the option of presenting from Jerusalem, I would have asked for the flight instead of the bus ticket to New Jersey. Let me start by noting as a second panelist that each of us was asked to think individually about these questions. And I think that you will hear some overlap. So when you do, I hope it will be reinforcing and not redundant. And I'll try to do my best to acknowledge where Alex and I do overlap. I'm going to start my piece by asking you all to do an activity with me. Okay, I want to leave this room, so to speak, and I don't really want to leave this room, I want to leave today. I want to roll back in time, if only we could. If we could, I'd look for my hair. And I want to go back 20 years. And I want you to imagine yourself 20 years ago walking into the lobby of a very, very tall building, getting into the elevator, and you're alone in the elevator, and just as the elevator doors are closing, another person dashes in, you press your floor button, they press theirs, and something inside of you lets you know, without a single word, that you are traveling with a fellow Jew. Your Judar goes off. Something triggers you, and you get into the Jewish conversation. And just a few minutes later, bing, the doors open, your fellow traveler steps off the elevator, and having had the Jewish conversation in that little bit of time, you know an enormous amount about that person. They said things like Reform, Hadassah, Ramah, Orthodox, Kosher, B'nai B'rith, APAC, right? And you walked away from that really saying, I found a fellow Jew. Now I want you to advance in time to today, walk into that same building's lobby, get in the same elevator, same scenario, the doors are closing, and you get this weak blip on your Judar, and you wiggle your way into the Jewish conversation. But when the elevator arrives at the floor, someone has to put their hand over that sensor, because you can't have that same conversation. Because they didn't say B'nai B'rith, Hadassah, Reform, Conservative. They said Shomer Shabbos, eats dairy out. They said belong to Young Israel, go to Chabad. They say belong to Temple Torah, go to Chabad, park around the corner. They said on Friday night, I go to a men's Scots Minion, and my wife goes to a women's progressive ovo-lacto-vegetarian drum circle. They say things like orthodyke. They say things like Hasidic reform renewal. And all of a sudden, you have no idea, really, who you just traveled this short journey with. I'm going to use it as a metaphor for what's happened in the context of the Jewish community. And as Alex said, the notion of community has changed. What constitutes Judaism has changed. What's constitute engaging has changed. And increasingly, you find the Jewish community in what I will call two camps, in and out. I want in, I want to be a part of it, and increasingly I want it on my own terms. I want exactly what I want. I want you to know exactly what I want, and by the way, there's a small caveat, everything I demand that I get on my own terms is subject to change, potentially tomorrow. And what I want and what I need may not be what the wants and the needs of the other people who share my household, critically, including my children. And whereas once I believe the Jewish community in North America was dedicated to giving their children their Judaism, the Judaism of the parents and grandparents, increasingly we don't know what Judaism to give them, because I think we have come to an awareness that we don't know what will be the world in which they live. We were asked to take on 3 questions. First one was, what are the emerging cultural trends in general, in Judaism in particular, that are affecting the Jewish way of life and education? So here are my thoughts. We have a rapidly changing notion of what constitutes communication, knowledge, and employment. And as these erode, they take with them the stabilizing forces of community and identity, making it extremely difficult to maintain any way of life or any system of living or thinking. And for us, it makes it particularly challenging to take on a tradition premised on continuity. We live in a culture of immediacy. We're used to getting what we want now. And we are losing the ability to be patient and to learn deeply. We live in a culture of rights rather than of obligations. There's a trend in education that I believe is particularly challenging to us. It's the movement away from the acquisition of knowledge with a focus on the application of skills and problem solving. And while those of us who work and live in a progressive educational setting might want to stand up and sing the Hallelujah chorus, what we've always asked for, we have to keep in mind that this may pose a real challenge to Jewish education, because so much of what has been part of the traditional Jewish educational systems seems to have fallen onto the acquisition side of things. Knowing a lot has historically been very important. Like it or not, we've put great currency in knowing as a measure of quantity and less currency in the applying of knowledge. There's a shifting notion as to whether or not the guiding question in education should be what, how, or why. We need to be able to find ways to continue to provide students the building blocks that will constitute what it means to be an educated person. But not only that, to figure out how they will apply what they learn in ways that we probably haven't considered seriously enough before. We live in a culture of globalism and universalism. And I want to think about Heschel's notion that the particular can be in service to the universal. And certainly the American Jewish community today seems to be drawn towards solving global and universal problems and seeing ourselves as part of that world, rather than being a particular tribe. But I do worry where that leaves the particular. Population implosion in some Jewish communities, juxtaposed to population explosion in other communities, will give the Jewish community challenges that I think that we just haven't discussed behind closed doors and with gloves on. We have Jewish communities that are actually disappearing. Think back, if you will, let's go back on that 20-year-ago journey in the elevator. Remember one-child China, right? Okay, a totalitarian government forced its people to stop having children, and the result today is China has more people than it ever could have imagined. All we do is stop our kids, when are you going to have a kid, and we are basically disappearing. Outside of Orthodox circles, the Jewish birth rate has dwindled down to virtually nothing. No matter the quality of job we do, we will run out of a population to serve. We have a widening chasm between the ways in which individual rights and obligations are expanding or contracting, and how one's perspective on these phenomena so profoundly assign us all to a particular camp. We open up today's newspaper or any newspaper of the last year. Look at states, those which are expanding rights in ways that we could not have imagined, and with which we may not agree, and those which contrast it. Let's take a look particularly at the hot-button social issues. Look at states legalizing gay marriage and other places that are restricting and perhaps even eliminating access to reproductive health. We are polarizing by demonizing. And we see this playing out in the Jewish community as well, in ways that I find to be devastating and destructive, but I must acknowledge that others find to be rewarding and important. We experience a loss of belief in and acceptance of central authority. Now, arguably, we could take that idea back to the 70s with us, too. It has already had an impact on the Jewish community. But along with that comes a decrease in a notion of loyalty. Loyalty towards institutions, towards brands, to labels, and even to one's individual identity. The challenge that we see related to that is being played out in front of us in certain denominational groups, political parties, religious groups in general. And there's this erosion of the loyalty, I'm going to call it loyalty by inertia. People who hang on to institutions simply to hang on to them without really investing the convictions that will take to keep those institutions alive. The rapid pace by which we allow ourselves to challenge previously revered and accepted catechisms will play out not only in the transformation specific to those phenomena, but the ability to do so will conceivably make easier the next generation of toppling conventional thinking. I'm going to go to the next question in service of time. The next question we're asked was, what are the essential questions emerging from these trends that should guide the design and development of curriculum for the 21st century. So here's my question list, which certainly pales by the questions that will be generated in this room. How do we identify and preserve our core values while adapting to the ambient changes in the ways that are necessary and healthy? How do we find the congruities between Jewish tradition and these emerging trends? And by contrast, what do we do when we decide that Judaism provides a needed counterweight against the trends that we find dangerous? How do we build bridges between the particular and the universal? How do we help parents and students understand how one enhances the other? And this is not simply a one-way street of the particular enhancing the universal. What are the fundamentals that the educated Jewish student needs to know in order to live a Jewish life? And when should those be taught? And how? And by whom? And how can we teach these in ways that inherently enhance creativity and make creativity the useful tool rather than the acquisition of facts? How can we develop curricula that respond to our reality of prosperity? And in what context will we place our curricular goals? What are the forces that we will use to impart their development? And lastly, we were asked, what are the fundamental elements of Jewish identity that must be preserved, even if they'll be challenged by the 21st century realia? So I'm going to use a disclaimer that, like Alex, I think that Judaism and Jewish identity will only be preserved in the context of community. I think it preserves in real community. I frankly don't know that virtual community will give us the same platform for that preservation. So here's what I think remains in place. The immutable, inescapable, unapologetic, irrefutable reality of being a text people, of being the people who, no matter where we live in our books. The enduring power of ritual. The belief that the human initiative is premised on our faith of a universe structured by moral laws that we ourselves did not write. The notion of peoplehood, that the Jewish people have a history and a religious tradition that do in fact connect the Jew in America to the Jew in Uruguay and the Jew in Poland and to the Jew in Israel. And in fact, this connection is not only defined or undefined by boundaries of space, but boundaries of time. So the Jew of the medieval day is bound to the Jew of the Enlightenment, to the Jew of today, and to the Jews who will one day build shuls on Mars. Likely to, one that you go to, and you know the rest of the joke. We must preserve Hebrew language as the unique language of the Jews, through which we access the sacred texts that allow us to share with the world our unique contributions to the world over time. Shabbat, the basic idea of unplugging and resting, that life isn't a constant whirlwind of buttons and making yourself known in 140 characters, but rather that Shabbat makes us who we are, because if God required rest and mindfulness, so too do we. The idea that there are core Jewish actions and Jewish beliefs that may have universal meanings and broader messages, but they uniquely reflect and come from the history and traditions of the Jewish people. And of course, the land of Israel, and beyond this, the simple notion of the state. That this is our home, our homeland, our land. We cannot imagine a Jewish future as wandering Jews again. And we must be willing to stand by and with Israel, regardless of any other political or cultural force pushing or pulling us away. And of course, purposefulness. The belief that all of this is neither random or irrelevant. I'll conclude with a quote from Heschel. I'd like to suggest, as a goal of Jewish education, that every Jew become aware that Judaism is an answer to the ultimate problems of human existence, and not merely a way of handling observances. Can you repeat that again? Heschel, 1953. I would like to suggest, as a goal of Jewish education, that every Jew become aware that Judaism is an answer to the ultimate problems of human existence, and not merely a way of handling observances. Thank you.